Good afternoon. My name is Matt Stein, Chair of the Board and President of CNOC. With me are Pete Rocca, Vice Chair of CNOC and CEO of Start.ca, a London, Ontario-based provider of Internet, TV, and home phone services over both wholesale and facilities-based platforms. Ian Stevens, Director of CNOC and CEO of Execulink Telecom, a Woodstock, Ontario-based provider of SILEC and CLEC voice, BDU services, facilities-based and wholesale-based services, as well as mobility services as an Mvno in Southwestern Ontario. Chris Tassett of Tassett Law, counsel to CNOC, Dr. Ziki Chen, Carleton University, and also assisting us and sitting immediately behind me is Stuart Cattrall of Tassett Law. For completeness' sake, I should also mention that while I am the CEO of Distributel, I'm appearing just for CNOC today. The Canadian Network Operators Consortium, known as CNOC, is an association of 31 competitive telecommunications service providers offering a variety of communication services such as home phone, television, and perhaps most famously, residential internet, not to mention all of the B2B and wholesale offerings our members have. Our members are innovative competitors who operate in difficult circumstances that include obtaining key wholesale inputs from reluctant dominant incumbents while competing with them and with each other to provide services that consumers want. In other words, our members live competition every day on the ground, making a difference to the wallet of Canadians. Services provided over the mobile wireless platform are increasing in significance by leaps and bounds, and that competition is critical if Canadians are to reap the full promise of the platform. 2019 CMR figures show revenues in the sector were $27.1 billion, just over half of all telecom revenues in 2018. Iveta margins in the sector reached a stratospheric 41% in 2018, while Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, or the Big Three, accounted for 91% of the revenues in the market. In our submissions to date, we've discussed the problem with the current retail markets for mobile wireless service, which include not only high prices, but also low product differentiation and high market concentration. It's clear that the mobile wireless needs of Canadians are not being met. Sufficient alternatives simply do not exist. The Big Three and regional carriers won't provide these options, and they have no desire to enable other service providers to do so either. It's time for the Commission to mandate the Big Three to provide mandated wholesale access for full Mvno. It's important to recognize that an Mvno needs to do most of the same things the big carriers do, other than build a radio network or have its own spectrum. A full Mvno invests in, builds, and operates its own backbone, secures its own interconnection agreements with other carriers to terminate traffic. A carrier of this type must also deploy a variety of facilities, including its own switches and servers, in order to interconnect with traditional MNOs. However, the Mvno does not have to incur the prohibitive cost of acquiring scarce spectrum before it can operate, removing one of the most significant barriers to entry. In fact, it bears reminding that the last time there was new entry, 3 very well-funded firms bought spectrum, built a network, set out to establish a brand and create a retail presence. We all know where the story ended. All 3 failed and were bought up by 3 of the 4 largest telecoms in Canada. Imagine the competitive benefits Canadians would have enjoyed had the billions of dollars they spent on spectrum and network construction been diverted to other aspects of their business. Canadians would have had 3 more national wireless providers to choose from and would be paying far less than they are today. Maybe it was too early to have a mandated Mvno regime at the time, but we've learned from the mistake and the time is now. The full Mvno option requires millions of dollars of investment by each Mvno. The option also provides an Mvno the flexibility to invest in available spectrum where there is significant or sufficient density to warrant such an investment. Importantly for Canadian consumers who are clamoring for lower prices or for greater choice, mandated full Mvno access can be made available immediately using interim terms and conditions with some minor changes to the national carrier domestic roaming tariffs. These interim conditions would involve the adoption of existing domestic wholesale roaming rates as interim full Mvno access rates and lifting the provision the prohibition on permanent roaming for full MVNOs. Full MVNOs can also add significant value and innovation in retail service in the market that other lesser forms of MVNOs cannot do. And we'd be pleased to provide examples if the Commission's interested. We caution the Commission not to accept other lesser forms of competition. For example, if only regional carriers are allowed to become full MVNOs, all Canadians will get is more of the same of undifferentiated services that we see in the market today. Recent developments, such as so-called unlimited data plans offered by certain carriers, are not indicative of the development of a sufficient level of overall competition. This is just a point-in-time response to government, regulator, and Competition Bureau focus in 2019. It's not practical for the Commission to run a proceeding like this yearly just to perpetually remind the big three to keep up their pretense of competition. Retail regulation is also not the solution. Retail regulation is inappropriate as it won't maximize the competitive benefits or promote competition in an economically efficient manner. More importantly, it will not unleash the competitive creativity enabled by a full MVNO regime, which gives competitors access to the building blocks they need to think outside of the box when designing new services. If all that is perpetuated is what exists, all society will get is more of the same. There will be no true disruption, and Canadians will not even know what's been lost. The technical implementation of a full MVNO model is easy. Full MVNO models have been developed in many countries around the world, and all the equipment vendors being used in all of our networks have deployed MVNO elsewhere. One of the most important terms and conditions of a successful mandated wholesale regime for full MVNOs will be a requirement for the national carriers to ensure that full MVNOs hosted on their networks are able to obtain access to mobile wireless devices. After all, connectivity is just one half of the mobile service. The other half is the device itself, the part you hold in your hand. Large device manufacturers such as Apple and Samsung are reluctant to sell their mobile wireless devices directly to smaller carriers, such as MVNOs. You can see this playing out by looking at the phone selection available on most networks below a certain size. Wind, even as an example, had trouble getting traction in the mind of consumers until it was able to offer the iPhone. Unless appropriate measures are taken, at best, MVNOs will only be able to obtain devices that are years old or from third-party suppliers. The inability to obtain access to the latest mobile wireless devices represents a serious barrier to entry. Consumers have an insatiable appetite for the latest and greatest mobile devices, and unless MVNOs can provide these devices, their ability to compete will be severely curtailed. To remedy the deficiency, CNOC is proposing the Commission impose a condition on the national MNOs that would prevent them from selling mobile wireless devices to their own customers unless they also make that device available to MVNOs on a white label basis, integrated for the host MNO network. We realize that the national carriers sometimes negotiate exclusivity periods for certain new devices with device manufacturers relative to other MNOs. And under our proposal, such reasonable exclusivity periods would be respected, and full MVNOs would only be able to sell these white label devices obtained from national carriers once the exclusivity period had expired. Final MVNO access rates should be set using the Commission's tried and tested Phase 2 costing method, plus an appropriate markup. This is the approach that encourages maximum retail pricing flexibility and including innovative service pricing and bundling by competitors. While we did not oppose negotiated alternatives, having a tariffed backstop is absolutely essential. Other issues that should be addressed in a final full MVNO access regime include device availability, final rates for the service, seamless roaming, and call handback. We could provide further details in response to your questions. However, none of these issues can or should hold up the establishment of an interim regime. We're aware of concerns about the amount of time Phase 2 costing can take and share those concerns. CNOC has been developing proposals to address the issue, which is caused by incumbent gaming and delay. CNOC will present its proposed solution in the upcoming proceeding, which is expected to launch shortly on the setting of rates for wholesale services. Without foreshadowing this too much, I'll simply point out that the current process can be gamed to make it take a long time, which ultimately only serves to benefit those who didn't want it in the first place. Creating a mechanism that favors speed on all sides will address this. The Commission should resist pleas for other pricing models, such as retail minus, which may seem to be straightforward, but would actually be as or even more difficult to implement, given pricing differences that vary by incumbent carrier, importantly, time and geography, and a lack of proper reference points due to deep discounts, many of which are not posted and are constantly changing. By linking a competitor's retail pricing to that of an incumbent, the creation of new and innovative services that are priced differently would also be stifled. A retail minus pricing model would do very little for unleashing the creative, competitive potential of the marketplace. The Commission should also reject a final offer arbitration method of setting rates. The information asymmetry between full MVNOs and the national wireless carriers will mean that full MVNOs will be at a profound disadvantage when it comes to final offer arbitration. Moreover, the horizontally and vertically integrated Big Three are not really motivated to come to a reasonable negotiated or arbitrated resolution of any rate dispute. Final offer arbitration will not satisfy the requirement in the Telecommunications Act that rates be just and reasonable, especially considering that the stakes of such an arbitration may be whether an MVNO can obtain reasonable rates through the process that will enable it to compete at all. In any event, no change in the method used by the Commission to set wholesale rates should be adopted before the Commission conducts the proceeding that will review how rates for wholesale services are set. I also want to address the much discussed investment boogeyman. According to this theory, frequently trotted out by the incumbents, unless they're allowed to continue to charge super competitive prices, prices that are much higher than is appropriate based on international comparisons, the incumbents will stop or significantly slow down investing. This line of reasoning is just not credible, and you should reject it for a number of reasons. First, just because the incumbents may receive less revenues in a more competitive environment, which is not necessarily true in any event, it does not follow that they'll need to make up the difference by slashing their investment budgets. In fact, the incumbents have many cash flow management options that would allow them to maintain their current levels of investment, including by deciding how much to pay in dividends to the shareholders and how much to retain in cash and short-term investments. Even if you did believe they wanted to pull investment back, the simple answer is that they will continue to invest because it still generates these kinds of returns. At what point do we simply say, enough? Canadians are tired of paying sky-high prices only enabled because we've allowed the Big Three to have their run of prices for far too long in too coordinated a fashion. Second, investment decisions are not made on a moment-by-moment basis. They're made based on a risk-adjusted evaluation of possible future outcomes over an extended time horizon. The reality as the incumbents have priced in the possibility of being required to provide mandated wholesale access in approving their current investment plans. The only way one could say the risk of mandated MVNO is not priced in would be to assume the Big Three didn't believe there's any likelihood of it happening. Did they not read the Commission's preliminary review in this proceeding? Did they miss the 2019 policy direction? Did they not hear the public outcry during the federal election? In addition, over the last several months, we've seen their op-eds, their expert reports, and their marketing campaigns that all tell us the Big Three realize their time of unchecked pricing is at risk. If they were going to pull investment because of mandated MVNO, they already would have. They wouldn't have announced 5G. They wouldn't be trumpeting their investments at investor conferences and on quarterly calls. They would have waited. Third, regional carriers would still thrive under the regime we propose. While they would not be required to provide full mandated MVNO, they would have the option of attracting their own wholesale business on a voluntary basis and at rates and on terms and conditions they set. They could also choose to operate as full MVNOs outside of their regional territories, all of which increase their revenues and give them opportunities. When it comes to selecting a remedy for the lack of competition in mobile markets, there's a lot more at risk than just those markets. The Commission should be mindful that, with some narrow exceptions, the regional carriers are all vertically, and in many cases horizontally, integrated service providers. Full MVNO is not only needed to ensure competition in mobile markets, it's essential for ensuring continuing and increased competition in the markets for bundled wireless and wireline telecommunication services. In the absence of such access, consumers will abandon competitors who cannot offer full bundles and will migrate back to the incumbents. This will result in a resurgence of a duopoly in the provision of wireline, while wireless services will be about as limited as they are today, with the same unfortunate outcomes for Canadian consumers. We urge the Commission to advance consumer interests by adopting the recommendations that CNOC is making in this proceeding. This concludes our presentation, and we'd be pleased to respond to the Commission's questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Commissioner Leisner.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a number of questions to ask you. I'm going to start with the issue of retail market power assessment. I note that in your executive summary at paragraph 21 in the May 15th, 2019 intervention, you take the position that competition has not improved in the 5 years since the Commission last reviewed the state of mobile wireless services in Canada, or since our regulatory policy 2015-177 was issued. Now, there have been some improvements in markets in terms of prices and in competitive rivalry, but what will we need to see happen, in your view, to see a sufficiently competitive market?
So, first of all, let me remind us all that the Bureau itself acknowledged that even where you have 4 players in a market, it's not necessarily an indication that there is no market power presence. I think one of the biggest things that we see, or maybe that we don't see, and that's what's so hard about this, is we don't see the service differentiation that needs to be present in a more competitive market. We've talked about pricing, and yes, some pricing has fallen, and we can, we happen to think that some of the more precipitous declines in the last few months are due to the regulatory scrutiny and political pressure that's been brought to bear, and so we're concerned that it may be temporary because that market power is still there. But above and beyond that, there are not the niche types of offerings that you heard about from Two Cows that you've seen listed in our submissions and the submissions of Tech Savvy, and that were just alluded to by the Distributel panel. And those are the losses. And the problem with that is that you won't know they're not there until you see them. And when you start seeing those, that's, I think, will be a good indicator that you're starting to reach a level of competition that's reasonable for Canadian consumers, in addition to additional price reductions that will follow.
Thank you. I noted that in your intervention, you also talked about the fact that you thought that if the national carriers reached an 80% market share threshold, that would be, in your view, a time where the Commission could review the state of the market in terms of possible forbearance from a mandated Mvno wholesale access regime. And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on how you came to this threshold. I'm referring to paragraph 39 of your May 15th submission.
So I'll start, and then I'll hand it over to...
And it was Dr. Chen's.
Yeah, I'll just start by giving a bit of background. Part of this is reflective of my age. I remember that in the long-distance days, when market shares started falling to around that level, that's when the Commission started looking at forbearance, and that's how we got the 95-19 decision. That was in part what was going on here, but I think there's also some other broader economic
Just if I can stop
that.
you for 1 minute, Mr. Chairman, I think I'm hearing some other noise. All right, I'll ask you to continue.
So now that's kind of why I'm comfortable with the number, but Dr. Chen has his own rationale as well.
Yes, in my first report, so that 80% I think came from me. It was proposed in paragraph 98 of my first report. I started that paragraph actually by saying that the specific values of the market share thresholds should be chosen to reflect the Commission's view on what a properly functioning competitive mobile wireless market in Canada should look like. and so on. I propose this as a preliminary number, and the rationale, my original rationale or consideration behind this 80% was for a long time we've been striving for a fourth carrier. So I basically, in my paragraph 99, I explained that if we imagine 4 carriers holding 20% of market share, and then the other competitive forces or other forms of competitors, such as 4 MVNOs accounting for the 20%. Let me back up. So it was based on considerations of one is HHI, and also the consideration of market share threshold for joint dominance issued by the Competition Bureau's guideline on for mergers. And basically, these are thresholds, these are necessary conditions in my proposal for conducting a full review. So I want to set it at a moderate level, so that it will be when we reach that threshold, then a review can be conducted. I guess I did. Another rationale which I would add is basically would be Dr. Chipty's report. She actually found that when the regional competitor, bearing in mind that that's the only form of competition to the national wireless carriers at the moment, when the regional carrier reaches a market share of between 5.5 and 20%, that's where the competitive impact is the most substantial one. So I was happy to see that actually the two numbers sort of match.
So just so that I understand your position correctly, that would be when you would recommend that the Commission undertake another wholesale review as we are doing now, as opposed to a bright line where we would say, that's it, we're no longer mandating or we're forbearing?
But partially, yes. I proposed 2 thresholds. One threshold for the combined market shares of competitors to national wireless carriers. The other threshold was for the MVNOs. My proposal is to have a 2-step approach. Ultimately, the test for forbearance should be based on market conditions, but to determine the timing of a review that leads to the forbearance, I propose as a first step is to monitor these 2 market share thresholds. When these thresholds are met for a sufficient number of Canadians in a sufficient number of areas in Canada, then the Commission move on to a full review.
And would these same conditions apply with respect to a review of mandated roaming? Have you looked into that? Well, if the national carriers were reduced, for example, to an 80% market share as a result of mandated MVNO access.
It might, but we'd have to do more analysis because that's a bit distinct market. But we'd want to check out whether that made sense for there. Really, what we're looking at here is. If you look at it from a smell test perspective, right now the regional carriers and others have about 10% of the total market. So what this really means is that when you get to double that, plus when you've got a significant enough percentage of MVNO, or sorry, of full MVNO only, so that they've gotten a foothold in the market, then you know you're onto something and you should do the test. It's a little bit different in roaming because you don't have that second element when it comes to just wholesale roaming, so you have to treat that threshold a bit different. So I can't really respond to your question today about what the right threshold would be for wholesale roaming, but that's the rationale here was based on 2 concepts. One is, when do we see a sufficient reduction in the in the share of the nationals and regionals, and when do we see MVNOs gaining a foothold in the market?
Understood. You've indicated in your written submissions that, in your view, the market share of the national carriers has remained largely unchanged since at least 2011, and there's certainly data to support that. How do you respond to arguments advanced that a better indicator of the competitive impact by newer entrant carriers is their share of recent net additions?
So additions is only one indicator, and that's, as I said, you have to look at a whole number of factors, including outcomes in the marketplace. So you can look at numbers of additions, you can look at ARPU, you can look at Iveta. There are a whole bunch of indicators, and the issue is, when you look at all of it, what does the smell test tell you? Which way are all of these arrows pointing, or the majority of them pointing? And the other part of this is, what's the outcome? And we come back to the first proposition, which is that with a lack of sufficiently differentiated services and other pricing options, it appears to us that merely because you've had some more additions hasn't really changed the market in a significant enough way.
Well, if we're looking at pricing, your argument is that the regional carriers are not having a material impact on competition. But there have been some notable price changes in the mobile wireless market. The interveners that have appeared before us ascribe those to different reasons. But we have seen the introduction, and you've talked about that a bit, of mobile wireless plans with no overage charges by the national MNOs. So do these movements in pricing in the wireless market change your initial position in any way?
We're not saying that there hasn't been any movement. I mean, the data is there. What we're trying to convey is that there are multiple layers to a competitive market, and yes, there is an increasing amount of competition, but it is not the full, vibrant competition throughout the country that we seek. That's our core message. So yes, and there are some provincial markets that are better than others, and we recognize that too in terms of pricing. So the data is there. We're not trying to refute that. It's really all about at what level is that competition overall.
And you submitted that if you compare Canada with international mobile wireless markets using various metrics, Canada is increasingly falling behind the rest of the world in terms of prices. And that view is at odds with the view of some other interveners. I'm thinking of TELUS and Rogers, who have questioned the relevance of the international comparisons, arguing that the studies that compare Canada with other jurisdictions don't compare apples to apples. They don't compare similar mobile wireless service plans. They don't take into account socioeconomic factors such as geography and population density. And I'd just like to get your views on those positions.
Dr. Chanwell.
I agree that no method of international comparison or even interprovincial comparison is perfect. No matter what method we use, I'm sure there will be smart people who will be able to point out weaknesses in the methodology. What I would say is we need to look at the overall picture. If you just have one or two studies saying Canada is lagging behind, yes, indeed, you can wonder whether whether the methodology was the main reason for those conclusions. But when you have numerous studies done by different consulting firms who have no financial stake in producing these studies, then the totality of these studies indicate the credibility of these observations, that is, Canada is lagging behind.
And are you thinking of any studies in particular?
With regard to
To
Canada's...
these comparisons that you think are of particular weight?
No, I have not thought about that, whether any particular one which should carry more weight than the others. I more or less treated all these numbers equally, and they all seem to paint a consistent picture. And that's what, in my view, most convincing.
Okay.
And I just want to add one thought here, and that is, we've heard people say, well, the data is kind of old, and, things have improved in the last year. We were looking at this, and one of the studies that we relied on earlier was a Rewheel study, and they do a very vast comparison of different pricing from all over the world. And most recently, in October of last year, they said while the Canadian median gigabyte price in smartphone plans fell during the second half of 2019, Canada's competitiveness among the EU 28 and OECD countries further worsened. Canada was ranked as the country with the fourth highest median gigabyte price in April 2019. In October 2019, Canada became the second most expensive country. And similarly, Strategy Analytics released a report in December of 2019 basically saying Canada remains the third most expensive country for 10 gigabit per month and the third most expensive for 1 gig. And finally, the OECD very recently ranked Canada 31st out of 37th in mobile penetration. So there are, like Dr. Chen says, still continuing multiple indicators that we still have a competitive problem in Canada.
We've talked to interveners that have appeared before us about negotiation of Mvno access or other similar type arrangements. And I'm just wanting to understand whether any of your members have approached any of the mobile network operators to negotiate Mvno access and what the experience has been.
While I can't characterize what all of our members have experienced, I'll ask if either of my two colleagues want to address it first, and then I'm happy to address it second. Sort of personal experience.
So at ExecuLink, we have sought Mvno. We have not achieved a broad Mvno service. We are fortunate enough to have license from the early 80s where we've got Spectrum as an ILEC. And we've been able to turn on a mobile service, but to provide a provincial service is just not something that the carriers are willing to entertain.
So have you provided the service based on the acquisition of the spectrum, or have you also entered into arrangements with other carriers?
So we launched about a decade ago, and we entered into commercial agreements at that time with other carriers, and they've evolved over the years in the recent to ensure we have got roaming for our customers, and that services associated with our licensed geography. We're able to provide services within our licensed geography of Spectrum.
And would you characterize those as temporary roaming agreements or more of an Mvno type model?
I'd characterize them as roaming agreements, and they are not what I would. If we had entered today, the marketplace today, the roaming tariff would have facilitated a very standardized agreement in our view. We are living a legacy of agreements that have been in place for over almost a decade, and the foundations of them is that roaming is needed for our customers to access services outside of the geography where our licenses are.
Okay.
My exposure is a lot more limited than Ian's. We've tried to engage some conversations, and we're not able to even get the phone calls. And when we've talked to people in person, we're told that we can do a resale where we're reselling the same brand product. So basically being a sales channel for them, but unable to get conversations about doing Mvno.
So it's more in the nature of if you resell their brand, they're willing to enter into an arrangement, whereas otherwise not so much.
In one particular carrier, yes.
Okay.
I'll say that in my experience across two different companies in this space, the conversation about actually having Mvno access is very short. The answer is very absolute. There is no follow-up. There is no willingness to have a conversation about commercial rates. There is no willingness to discuss innovative services. It just ends right there. In one of those cases, the conversations largely took place prior to the acquisition of Fido. So in that case, conversations with Fido actually moved to the point of a very, very basic Mvno, with a lot of restrictions on what phones and what those packages need to look like. After the purchase by Rogers, that all just basically stopped.
Okay.
So, in other words, it's been a very long time, if you think back to when Fido was purchased by Rogers, it's been a very long time since there's been any willingness to have that conversation.
Right. In terms of your membership, is there a geographic area in which they wish to provide services as MVNOs?
I think that each of our members tends to have an area that they feel that they do particularly well, or an area they're, I'm going to say, so to speak, from in terms of where they started and so forth. And those do apply. But many of the members, my own company as an example, we're active in multiple provinces, and we would be interested in MVNOs across the footprint on which we offer internet, TV, and home phone services. It's really just the ability to expand and offer that entire home bundle.
And how about in terms of urban versus rural areas?
Now, we have certain members in CNOC who do focus in a particular rural area, but many are as focused on urban as they are in rural. There's no specific focus one way or the other, nor an interest for it to just be one or just be the other.
Okay. You've indicated that the Commission should compare the Iveta margins of Canadian MNOs with those in international jurisdictions. There have been some interveners that have criticized Iveta as being a poor indicator of profitability, for instance, Rogers, because it doesn't take into account the opportunity cost of capital or the depreciation amortization charges, which are significant because it's such a capital-intensive industry. Do you still consider Iveta as an appropriate measure to assess market power in the wireless industry?
As it is one of a number of good measures. EBITDA is one, ARPU is another. There are all sorts of measures of profitability from wireless. I think what is important is the measure you're using a standardized measure that gives you across all your comparisons, and EBITDA is. So clearly there's a difference between an EBITDA of 20 and 40, regardless of what is in or excluded from it. It is still a significant measure. It is a consistent measure, and so it still tells a story. All of those companies in Europe also exclude depreciation and the cost of capital. It's not like they're including it and we're not, and that's why our numbers are higher. So if you look at the data in a consistent way, it still tells you something important.
And I'll add to that. Certainly, the stock markets look at EBITDA. All of the quarterly conference calls refer to EBITDA. All the financial reports refer to EBITDA. If there's a far better measure, we're open to looking at that too. But certainly, everybody seems to be talking about EBITDA. So I don't think it's reasonable for us to just throw it out and pick something that they like better.
And we've talked a lot about plans that would address customers looking for low-cost occasional use plans. Is this an area or a niche area where your members would be interested in providing service?
Yes, I feel that it is. Like I said earlier, I can't speak for every member, but I certainly can speak for my company, and it's a common conversation. We do tend to offer, the members of CNOC do tend to offer a number of value plans. I would expect that that would be an area that our members do focus on. But I think that affordability takes on many forms. And I think that it's just as likely that while that will certainly be addressed at the low price end of the market, other aspects of affordability will be addressed too. And the more options that there are, the better there are. So the more options and the more the more individual plans from the more companies as possible, the more individuals can choose the affordable option that fits for them.
And do you think that's feasible in terms of the rate that you would be paying for access to the spectrum?
It certainly that my answer is based on the belief that the rate will be reasonable and so forth, that it will be based on a cost plus phase 2 kind of model, and that in the end it is a rate that allows us to go out and offer those sorts of things. There was conversation that we've heard so far during this proceeding about some wireline examples that we're offering and targeting some very low-priced offerings. And I remember listening and thinking to myself, wow, the tariff prices are dramatically higher than that exact price that's being quoted and thrown around. So yes, it certainly does require that the right cost inputs are made available to our members. But I think that we've already shown, our members have already shown an ability to take good cost inputs and turn them into fantastic retail prices.
And what about, those special programs like the ISED Connecting Families program that deals with wireline? What are your views on adopting a similar plan in the mobile wireless sector?
Just to clarify your question, are you asking if CNOC members would be interested in participating in an ISED-led program such as that one to offer things like that to Canadians?
Yes.
Sure. I can't see why we wouldn't. That's certainly would be something we'd be interested in, again, assuming that it was based on a cost-plus rate that made sense and it was economically viable to do so. That would be wonderful.
Okay. Just so I don't forget, I'm going to ask you a little bit about win-backs. You've heard interveners talking about their concerns on win-backs and other interveners talking about prohibition on win-backs being anti-competitive. So I'd like to have the view of your association on win-backs.
I guess I'll answer, and then I'll ask Chris if he wants to add anything. We heard that as well, and we're supportive of the idea of there being a win-back period or an anti-win-back period. There used to be one in other areas, such as on wireline, and I think that it was a very effective tool at letting a customer make a decision, move over to the new provider, and not be pestered and try to win back. It also required people to be more competitive at keeping their customers rather than just dealing with them at the moment of cancellation. Rather than making the churn reduction department really only happen in retention, they had to be aware of it throughout the life cycle of a customer, and they had to pay attention to the life cycle of the customer. So I think that the sort of that anti-win-back thing is something that we not only do we support as it relates to wireless, but we would like to see that enlarged and offered across more services, wireline too. And so, I'll ask Chris if he wants to add something as well.
I'd be interested to hear on what your views on what constraints should be put on win-backs.
I'm a little foggy in my recollection, but I think that the win-back restrictions that were in place for wireline were a good model. I'd have to go back and see the precise details of that. But I think from a competitive standpoint, my sense was that CNOC members were, and other market participants were satisfied with the approach at the time. And so something similar like that. Certainly there should be some sort of cooling off period, like Matt says, that does give the person an actual opportunity to try the new service. And as Matt said, I think one of the benefits of doing that is that the existing carrier, when you're their carrier, would try to keep you happy throughout the relationship rather than just focus, knowing that they could scoop you right back by just giving you 20% lower and so on.
So Shaw, I believe, proposed a 90-day prohibition on any win-back activity. Is that a range that you're supportive of? If you want to consider and provide us with more information through an undertaking, that's acceptable too?
We are supportive of that. I believe that's longer than the prohibition was in the wireline, but we are supportive of 90.
Okay. I'd like to ask you a few questions relating to the wholesale access regime. There are parties that have argued that wholesale Mvno access is not an essential service in the same way as wholesale roaming was found to be essential in 2015-177, our regulatory policy. So I'm trying to get a sense of how you see the essentiality test being applied to this service. In terms of the geographic market, if we were to mandate the service on a regional level, say at the provincial level or at the census metropolitan area level that was discussed earlier this week, would that have an impact on your members in terms of reducing the likelihood of entry by your members? So I guess what I'm asking you is, does it have to be a national mandate to be effective for your members?
I think given that most members will be starting from zero and their proportion of wireline markets is already very low, and the logical starting point for them will be to market to their existing customers first. To make it viable, I think you need a fairly large geographic area to begin with. Because there is some upfront investment required in the service as well. Besides which, I think as an economic matter, we kind of agree with the Commission's pre-stated view that that market is a national market. We were actually surprised to see the Bureau's recommendation operate potentially in a way that would only cause small incremental changes in competition across small markets. If you actually think about how it would manifest in terms of an outcome, what they're proposing would actually have small incremental effects rather than providing a national service. And in fact, we were also surprised that they actually never even addressed the question in their report of what is the size of the wholesale market. They never refuted the notion that it was national in scope. So we remain convinced that the national perspective is the correct one, because what you want is to make it as easy as possible for these entrants to discipline pricing across Canada's geography, and also recognizing that we're dealing with a mobile service, and the whole benefit of mobility is that you can cross from one area to another and still have the service. So the service becomes highly devalued if you go to CMA and your call drops. It's not that much of a service anymore.
Right. There are also arguments that the radio access network is not an essential service because it's been duplicated by the regional carriers. And I'd like your views on whether you think that in regional areas where regional carriers have duplicated the RAN, do you think that this would decrease the likelihood of further duplication by a new facilities-based competitor in the region?
So we all know spectrum is very scarce. We all know that much of the usable spectrum for today and tomorrow's technology has been acquired. So the likelihood of having further pure facilities-based entry, I think, is quite low. I just don't think that's likely to happen right now. I think those who are already stakeholders will also do their best, if there is more, to scoop it up as quickly as they can possibly do so, bearing in mind that the regionals of today are not the regionals of a decade ago. The regionals of today are very financially strong, horizontally and vertically integrated entities who have the financial capability to do that, along with the national carriers. So when you look at all of those factors together, I think the likelihood of more facilities-based entry that's RAN-based is pretty remote.
Okay. What do you think of the likelihood of RAN that's duplicated on a regional basis also being duplicated on a national basis by the same carrier?
I think they're going to continue expanding. I think as it makes sense for them as competitors, those competitors who have spectrum in the relevant areas will expand to fill their footprints. Whether they can, but they're going to have the same problem acquiring more spectrum that I just mentioned.
Right.
So there will come a point at which they've kind of filled in the contours of what's attainable, and then they'll come to the same problem that everyone else has in the marketplace who's providing services.
Okay. And I understand your position to be that the national wireless carriers have market power in the upstream wholesale market for the Mvno access service. That's an accurate assessment of your position? Correct. So if we assume that there is that upstream market power, if we denied wholesale access to MVNOs, do you think that would substantially lessen and prevent retail competition?
Yes, on the basis that I discussed at the beginning of our conversation, absolutely.
And we talked about this a little bit in another context, but how do you define substantially when we're looking at the wholesale market? Is there a market share threshold that would be substantial?
Well, as you know, competition has both price and non-price factors. And in fact, the Bureau in its recent broadband market study cited that some of the non-price factors can be even more important than pricing factors. So it's not just about price, it's not just about market share, it's about the combination of supply and demand factors. I think you kind of have to do the full analysis to figure that out. I'm afraid there's no particular shortcut to that, as much as I would love to have one to bring to you.
So, you don't feel that you can pin down how you define substantial then?
It has to be relative to all of those factors,
Okay.
I think. I'm sorry,
Fair
I
enough.
can't do more
No,
for
fair
you,
enough.
but I'd be, I think, running. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Not directly, but the Competition Bureau, in their merger assessment, they have some sort of
They have a threshold.
threshold for substantial lessening or prevention of competition on the price front. So the hypothetical monopolist test is the 5% threshold, but if we use that as a reference point, then a substantial lessening of competition will be something even less than 5% of price increase than what would have been whatever the benchmark was. So, but I agree with Chris that on the wireless market case, we should be looking at not just prices, but also choices or offers of different services. And this is an area I believe MVNOs can make a significant difference.
Okay. If the Commission were to mandate the service under the model proposed by CNOC, I'd like to get a sense of how you think the entry would look like, how it would unroll, how many new providers might enter, and then talk a little bit about where you see the market share collectively going and what kind of a time frame. I think Distributel talked about that a little bit before you came to the table.
Yeah, it is a little bit of crystal ball gazing, a little bit of speculating, but I suspect that under our model there would be nationally somewhere in the maybe 10 to 15 total MVNOs over time, not all of which obviously would be from our members. Maybe half of that would be from our members. There is substantial investment just to get going, so to speak, to make the first phone call, carry the first minute or first bit. But then beyond that, there's very substantial investments in marketing and so forth that go into it as well. So I think that is probably the number.
What do you think is a reasonable time frame for an MVNO to enter the market under your model? Yeah,
I think that from whatever the go date is, sort of from when it actually could happen, you're probably looking at the first in-market, I would say, in some capacity in less than a year. But it would probably sort of get up to a full complement by the end of perhaps 2 or even 3 years with those entrants actually being in market.
And in terms of market share, I think Distributel was talking maybe in the 10% range. What's your view of that?
So when we look at the sort of the
10 to 20%, I think is what.
Yeah, when we look at international data, certainly the 10% is attainable. Depending on how the regime unfolds, it could go higher, but I certainly think that as a starting point, early on, 5 to 10% are good numbers to look at, and beyond that, we'd have to see what the conditions are, how the market develops, and so on.
You made comments in your opening presentation about the investment risks that were mentioned by the mobile network operators, the big three. So if we look at risk and how it might increase the cost of capital for carriers, Bell, in their written interventions, noted a financial analyst report that said, with MVNO regulation, we expect that the weighted average cost of capital to rise, driven by lower equity valuation and higher cost of debt, incorporating higher risk. The higher weighted average cost of capital will increase the hurdle rate for investment. If the carriers are good stewards of capital, then the combination of lower return on investment capital and higher weighted average cost of capital will make investment projects less likely to be approved over the medium to long term. And I'm referring to the Bell Mobility Executive Summary of November 22nd at paragraph 25. So, hypothetically speaking, if I'm an investor and someone's asking me for money to build a wireless network, but the network would be shared with others who would compete for the same customers that I am, would you agree that that would elevate the risk profile of my investment as an investor?
I'm going to back up one previous step. I will get to directly answering your question, but I think it's important to back up for this reason. I think it's important at the outset to recognize that there are other alternatives that the nationals and the regionals have for dealing with the consequences of mandated access. One of the things that they do is they love to guard and gatekeep their networks so they can charge Canadian consumers higher prices. If, on the other hand, the Commission were to signal to them that they have to use other avenues, I think you would find that they would get a lot better at starting to share their networks and cooperate with each other in ways that fills up the capacities on their existing networks, allows them to use each other's networks, just like Bell and Telus did after they ended up buying the bulk of that very expensive spectrum. They had to do something. They couldn't keep spending that money after they bought that spectrum. So what did they do? They came up with the wonderful solution of let's have a network sharing agreement. Now, we don't oppose network sharing agreements except for except we think that they need to be carefully scrutinized for potential anti-competitive effects, and that's one thing the Commission would need to do under that regime. But I think, first of all, the premise is false that the only path is one of we have to invest more, or if we don't, the future's gone. There are other ways to deal with this that conserve cash and actually don't require high levels of expenditure, and they've chosen not to do that for other reasons. The other question to answer, getting more directly to answering your question, is, okay, what's the right level of investment? And it ties into what I just said. Just because you can put $1 down to build a tower or a piece of wire doesn't mean that that is going to translate into ultimate benefit for Canadian consumers. There is a long and tortuous path and many, many incentives along the way that are all legitimate but different. Shareholders want to maximize dividends. So yeah, there have to be some trade-offs between dividends and investment. Executives of large carriers want to maximize their compensation, which depends on hitting certain financial targets, whether they be EBITDAs or net income or dividend thresholds. All of these things drive. So it's not like the minute you say, okay, let them keep that dollar immediately translates into a new tower or a new wire. And the third thing to recognize is that the executive summary you just read seems vaguely familiar, but not because it was from this proceeding, because it's been from every other proceeding that I've been involved in the past 30 years where the issue of opening up markets has come. There's a sort of number of points. They go, first of all, we have a regulatory compact and you're breaking it. If you do this, we're not going to invest. The cost is going to be too high. Nobody's going to take up the service. All of these are the standard responses you get every time you're faced with opening up a wholesale market. And the reality is the sky hasn't fallen. They told us they wouldn't invest in FTTN. Most of them are done with their FTTN rollouts and are moving on, and have long since moved on to FTTP and done a lot of rolling out of FTTP. You were about to mandate FTTP. They said, oh, if you do that, we're going to slow down and stop building. The other point I want to make is that even if you were to take them at face value and say, okay, there's some impact on investment, the reality is that the impact, and this comes from Bureau analysis. If you look at the broadband market study, I know it was wireline, but I think the principles hold equally true here. The Bureau in its report asked the incumbents for data to find out how they're dealing with this issue of access versus, and some of them refused to provide answers, saying that the cost and difficulty of providing the information was too great. Others did provide information, and what the Bureau said was, in these records, the Bureau observed real-world examples where profitable investments became unprofitable under differing regulatory treatment. On both a theoretical level and based on the business records that the Bureau has reviewed, this negative effect on investment incentive will most likely be felt at the fringes of a network. Some areas may be so densely populated, strategically important, or otherwise relatively cheap to deploy that investment will occur except under the most onerous conditions. That means that the strongest reduction in investment is most likely to be felt in areas where population is relatively sparser. And in this proceeding, at paragraph 127, I believe, of its further comments, Rogers said exactly the same thing. They didn't say, we're not deploying 5G in the GTA. We're not deploying it even in Brantford, Ontario. They said rural and remote areas might not get it. And maybe there'll be some delays in them getting it. Maybe there won't. We don't know. But even if you took it at face value, I think the question you have to ask yourselves is, do you want to sacrifice the benefits of competition across the whole country because of a problem that, if and when it manifests, will manifest at the fringes of the network? If the answer to that question is no, there are other remedies that you folks can come up with, that this commission can come up with, to deal with those specific cases. So what I'm urging you to do is not to use an overbroad reluctance to open up the wholesale market because of this threat, because even under their own, both theory and their own information, this threat is quite limited. And if it does manifest in a way that could harm a subset of consumers, there are other ways to deal with that, short of denying Canadians the benefit of competition.
Thank you.
I'd like to just add two things. When Chris was talking about, the sharing of the networks and, spending $1 on that investment and benefiting Canadians, I think there's lower prices can come in a lot of different ways, and some of it can be through more efficient use of investment dollars. And I don't think success should be the total number of dollars that are invested, rather the benefits that Canadians get from the investment of those dollars and efficient use that enables lower prices and innovation. And I wanted to add one more comment specifically around the cost of capital. If the Commission determines that the prices that Canadians are paying are too high, whether or not the amount of revenue that the Big Three receive through lower retail prices directly to their customers, or whether or not it's lower revenues received through rents of competitors through an Mvno process, would have the same effect in that cost of capital.
Okay, thank you.
And I just have one little thing to add, and
Absolutely.
that is, I think the 2019 policy direction points a very strong arrow in this direction. If you look at a number of the provisions, one is encourage all forms of competition and investment. In other words, not just necessarily in transmission facilities, which is what we're talking about. If we look at foster affordability and lower prices, particularly when telecommunications service providers exercise market power, which the Bureau confirmed. Reducing barriers to entry into new market and to competition for telecommunications service providers that are new, regional, or smaller than the incumbent national service providers. I note that the word new is next to regional. That word new must have a meaning. If all they wanted to do was reinforce the regional presence, they would have said so. And finally, enable innovation in telecommunications services, including new technologies and differentiated service offerings, which is one of the key benefits of competition. Thank you.
Okay. You've talked about MVNOs being likely to target niche and underserved areas of this mobile wireless services market. So what areas specifically do you consider to be underserved right now? I know you've talked about flanker brands, which you believe are providing one plan as opposed to a variety of plans. They're all following each other, if I understood your comments correctly. So can you unpack a little bit for me what you consider to be an underserved market and where your members would target?
So we did provide some examples initially in our first submission, and I don't recall all of them, but there are also some good international examples, and I think those are the relevant ones because we simply don't have them. So to say, what could be, you kind of have to look at what's happening somewhere else. And there are plans that target specific demographics, whether it be linguistic, whether they be ethnic,
right,
whether they be involved with other types of packaged financial or other services, loyalty programs, you name it. There are all sorts. There's even one company, I can't remember the name of it, in the U.S. that holds a bunch of patents. So, and it's an Mvno. So to say that Mvno don't innovate would be wrong. Again, but that doesn't mean every Mvno has to be forced into that model. You don't get to go past go unless you have 10 patents. You want the whole spectrum of innovation that can ensue.
And so you would say that the flanker brands are not serving that market right now?
So, yeah, I'd just like to add a comment. I think you asked about what kind of niches, would, members of CNOC target. And, I think you'd look at, today we're seeing a huge growth in secondary mobility devices such as tablets. Next year, maybe it's personal safety devices. Maybe the year after that, it's alarm systems. I think what's important is that it's almost impossible to predict, what the innovation of the future would hold, and having a full Mvno framework that was properly costed would really allow that innovation to flourish. We look at, just in ways that we can't predict today. If you were to look at the search engine market in the 90s, no one would have looked at it and say, okay, well, what kind of niches can the search engine market fill, and have any kind of clue or the magnitude or benefits that a company like Google would bring 20 years later. It's ultimately that that openness and open and fair playing ground that allows that innovation to flourish.
Do you think that the concerns of some parties that MVNOs would simply be targeting the regional carriers is accurate, and that the national carriers will just derive revenue from the service, but the regional carriers are going to feel the hit in terms of their customer base?
No, I simply don't think that's the case. I think that there are a number of reasons. I'll touch on a couple of them. First of all, when considering where to target your product, the place that has the largest amount of market share is a pretty good place to aim. Targeting at the regionals doesn't seem as likely to me. Certainly the price gap that one would expect to be able to create if you're positioning against value, or you're positioning value, should be much larger and therefore easier to establish in the eyes of the consumer between the national carriers and an MVNO versus a regional. I think there are many other reasons. I think I just don't see that as likely.
So would it be fair to say then that the MVNOs would be targeting more the flanker brands customers?
No, I would say that
Or it's just across the board?
I think it is across the board, and I think that each individual MVNO is going to be targeting something different. It needs to be stated again, the opportunity to innovate in this sector is huge when the big three simply do the same thing as each other. I mean, even the big 2019 innovation, let's decide 2019, let's offer unlimited. Let's also throttle when it gets past a certain point. Within a couple of days, let's all individually and without provocation of the others, let's all launch virtually the exact same thing at virtually the exact same price after a decade plus of not doing it. They're all doing the same thing. That makes it a very ripe market for an MVNO to come in and innovate with something very different. And I know that we can't necessarily give you examples of what would happen here in Canada, but we certainly can give you lots of examples that did happen in wireline of innovation that led the market into a new direction. In wireline internet, you saw things like unlimited. One of the members of CNOC, again in the wireline internet space, decided over a decade ago they were going to go online and they were only going to market themselves on a near one-to-one basis in online forums. At the time, nobody was doing that. They did it. Now everybody's doing it. Mm-hmm. You saw retail operations popping up in big box stores, being frankly, one of our members doing that. You saw one of our members offering annual plans. Like, we're not talking about prepaid, yet it was targeted towards an affordability issue, yet it was sold on an annual basis rather than a monthly basis. The point is that these were all innovations. They didn't necessarily come from the greatest new piece of technology, but they came in a different way of selling it or in a different way of reaching out to a different constituency of users or customers, and it resonated. And they all built large bases of customers and fans from doing so. So I think, Dr. Chen, did you have something you wanted to add here from before or no? It's okay if you answer.
You made my point.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
You talked, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think one of the things you'll find is that all the competitors are creative and resourceful and lean and just need the tools in order to be able to provide that innovation to Canadians. We all provide a different way of looking at things and different ways of addressing affordability, needs of consumers in niche markets. And I think that's what you find in a full MVNO is that you'll have a variety of competitors competing in different ways.
Okay. You've talked about setting of rates and being, I think you'd like the commission to get into that exercise. What do you see as an appropriate level of return on investment in any established tariff rate for the carriers?
So I'm going to answer this in a slightly more theoretical way, because and I'm sort of planting a seed. I know there's a costing proceeding coming because of the way you asked it, the rate of return. The reality is the way that the phase 2 costing plus a markup is done today is not actually particularly helpful in dealing with risk premiums. The reality is that if you really wanted to get at that, the way to do it is to look at the cost of capital that's actually embedded in the phase 2 costs. And hopefully, you know, when we get through whatever costing proceeding, that will be one of the changes that evolves from it. So we'd have to look at a whole new way of actually doing this for me to answer your question precisely,
Okay.
because the sort of markup over phase 2 costs, which was traditionally used to contribute towards fixed and common costs, the commission then added another piece to that to estimate for risk premium, but it's not really, you know, it's not really a precise way of doing it that's actually reflective that you can trace back to the cost of capital that the incumbent's actually paying. So that's why I'm answering the question in the way you are, because you asked it as a cost of capital question.
Do you think it would be appropriate to add a risk premium to any markup?
If one could demonstrate that there was an actual risk, yes. And I think that's the first exercise, as I've said. But I think you need to look at exhausting your other options first. So, for example, if through a regulation you can point them in a way that's going to actually help them reduce or mitigate that risk, that should be the first recourse. If risk is unavoidable to achieve a regulatory objective, and the foremost of those would be enhancing competition in retail markets, then certainly some form of risk premium is warranted under those circumstances. But it should be no greater than the risk premium that they face in the capital markets. And the problem that I have had conceptually with the way it's done today is that that linkage simply doesn't exist right now. So the risk premium that's sort of embedded in the markup is not really directly correlated to that.
Shaw has taken the position that MVNOs will emerge naturally in Canada once facilities-based competition has matured. And I gather that you don't support that view of the world. Is there any regulatory intervention that the Commission could undertake to develop a more favorable market condition for service-based competitors other than mandating wholesale MVNOs?
I can't think of it. I can't think of one. Okay. I know that, at least in my case, I'm sure in many members of CNOC's case, for over a decade we've been trying to work with the various big three to get access to sell a wireless product. I certainly have tried everything. I've tried asking for direct resale. I've tried asking for full MVNO, a resale MVNO, you name it. I can't see anything that could reasonably create competition anywhere near the likes of what a mandated MVNO would, and I think that it would be a half measure at best. And
you don't believe that, given the cost of spectrum and other issues, that a third national network would organically occur?
No, and I don't believe that a market for MVNOs would form. As you characterize Shaw's point, that they would form after facilities-based competition reached a certain point, I just don't see that as likely. I don't see that as likely because the four largest communications companies in the country are the only ones aiming at national coverage, and they're very content not to do that. In fact, in the case of Shaw, there was interest when they were still called Wind before the acquisition in talking and discussing MVNOs. But once the era of Shaw began, that door was shut.
And if we look at the model suggested by the Competition Bureau, which would concentrate on regional competitors, do you see that as a basis for getting those regional carriers to expand their facilities? You just don't think that goes far enough?
Yeah, I think you asked me
okay.
that earlier, and I said, yes, they'll probably expand their facilities, but will it bring the full benefits of competition? No. Will they be that much more likely to provide voluntarily full MVNO national solutions? I don't think so, because they are horizontally and vertically integrated. I think one of the reasons you see successes in other countries is because in a lot of those countries, the carriers that have adopted voluntarily MVNO regimes are ones that are not vertically and horizontally integrated. If you look at Sprint and T-Mobile in the U.S., they are the exceptions. AT&T is integrated. They have not been interested in doing voluntary MVNO deals to the same extent. They've done some because others have, but the leaders have been T-Mobile first and then Sprint. They wanted to fill those pipes. That's all they had. They had no way to leverage their dominant status in adjacent markets, so they had to do something.
And do you support a model where entities without wireless or wireline facilities are eligible to become MVNOs?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Now, how would that increase the incentive for those entities to invest in facilities? If they have free access as an MVNO, they don't have any facilities, wireline or wireless, where's their incentive to build out?
Well, first, you said free access. I assume you meant access to it freely as opposed to access for free. Certainly, they're
Right.
paying for it. We don't believe that service-based competition requires that they be making facilities-based investments. So if I understood your question correctly, and perhaps I missed it, but if the question is what would incent them to invest in facilities, we're not suggesting that it would.
Okay. And equally then, that really isn't going to help investment in rural or remote areas either. They will just occupy their space without investing in facilities.
Well, keep in mind that those rural areas, if they're not served, there are still customers. The same number of customers are there looking for a provider, whether or not MVNOs are there or not. So there is a business case in those rural areas. And maybe that business case is a little bit different. Maybe it requires less or more government intervention, but there is still a business case there. And we don't think that there's much likelihood that that changes.
Okay.
Sorry, I'd like to just focus on the word facilities, because we talk about facilities. What I think the way you're using it is in terms of wireless, it's RAN is what you're talking about, right? And we've already ascertained that the RAN capacity is fixed. So really, the debate shouldn't be about do we want to force people to try and spend a lot of money on wireless so that they can't offer cheaper, innovative prices. To us, the discourse should be, how do we use the spectrum that's out there and for which people do have to have paid and would like to see some return investment, how do we fill that capacity as best we can? And that's where service-based competitors have a role to play. And again, I want to come back to the 2019 policy direction because it's very specific, encouraging all forms of competition and investment. I think that is a very strong signal. It's a turning point away from the previous focus on you must build transmission facilities, wireless or wireline. I think those words are there for a reason, and they're to point us in the direction that when you're trying to stimulate competition, other types of investment are equally valuable and shouldn't be discounted or belittled.
Now, Cogeco has indicated that under their hybrid model, that would be an incentive to increase investment in wireline facilities. And I understand that you do not generally support their model, but do you see any way that it could be modified to address the issue of further wireline investment, especially rural investment?
I think it's an illogical model because, you know, I don't agree with the commission and with the Bureau or with Shaw, but at least their model has some internal logical consistency to it. The Cogeco model doesn't have any consistency because it's, if one were to have this hypothetical objective of increasing wireless competition, the mere fact that you have wires in the ground does nothing to further that. All it does is it allows Cogeco, who would be the prime beneficiary of this, to get entry and keep everybody else out. That's all you would have achieved under that scenario. That, you know, I'm looking at the output of what this actually does on the ground at the end of the day. What's the outcome? And that would be the outcome. It doesn't do anything for guaranteeing that they're going to, you know, really have wireless facilities over time just because they have access facilities now or fiber somewhere.
Okay. If we look at the Bureau's model, and the Bureau has indicated that it thinks that the regional disruptors, as the term has been used in this hearing, should be granted a time-limited Mvno access, but I gather that their model would not serve your members well, as many of them would not qualify. But if the commission were to go down the road of the Bureau model, would that encourage your members to purchase spectrum and deploy a network in new areas?
No, I don't believe it would. I don't believe that's practical.
And is that simply because of the costs of acquisition of spectrum? Are there other factors?
I think it's primarily the cost of acquisition of spectrum. As I spoke to in the opening remarks, we saw what happened the last time a major undertaking tried to buy a lot of spectrum and build out services. It might create some small pockets of competition, but it certainly doesn't correct the situation we have today of so many Canadians feeling they spend so much more than is appropriate on wireless services.
The other thing I want to point out is just the timing element. There's, based on the surveys you've had from Canadians, based on everything that we hear, there is a real sense of urgency to do this. And you heard the Bureau, towards the end of its testimony, talk about, well, next steps, we have to have a further proceeding to operationalize this. And that's a problem for Canadians. The beauty of the full Mvno system, and I really can't stress this enough, is you change some words in the tariff and you get them to enable protocols that are already there under the GSM system that all of them use to interconnect with each other. And you basically allow unidirectional permanent roaming by full MVNOs. You don't need to do anything more. And you have a set of interim rates to use. And those who say those rates don't apply, again, I don't understand the logic for that, because full MVNO is roaming. It's unidirectional roaming, but it's still the same domestic roaming service. It's priced the same on a unit basis. So it's certainly good enough as a starting point, and you can tweak it afterwards. But you could get this thing going in months if you wanted to by doing that, as opposed to, okay, let's have a follow-up proceeding to see how all of this will get operationalized.
And if the Bureau model were adopted, in your submissions, I think you've indicated that the regional carriers would choose to launch full MVNOs of their own. They would be the biggest beneficiaries of mandated wholesale access. The incumbent-owned regional carriers would be in a position to increase their revenues very substantially. Is that a bad thing? because there would be service to potential customers throughout all of Canada, and not just in the regions where they have home network coverage?
I think that's one of the benefits. That's the
Okay.
point. The point is you want, and CNOC members aren't afraid of that. We're not trying to create an exclusivity of any kind and saying, well, they're not eligible because they're already regionals. We're not saying that.
You want to coexist?
You want to coexist, absolutely. And that's because we're confident we can find the niches that Canadian consumers want that are not being served today.
But if there was an incremental approach, which is what the Competition Bureau is suggesting, like limit it to regional carriers, disruptors, do you think you would still benefit in terms of, getting access to excess capacity?
Are you asking if
On the
Canadians
regional carriers?
would Canadians benefit or would MVNOs benefit?
Both.
If under the Bureau approach, I don't see how MVNOs would benefit
Okay.
because they would all be the existing regional carriers. So they would benefit because they are the pre-selected competitors.
But if the regional carriers were permitted to sell excess capacity,
I don't think there's anything that stops them from doing it today, and
Okay.
none of them are
They
really
haven't
all
done
that
it.
interested in that conversation. So, in other words, I don't see them
no,
as
I
having
understand.
that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I understand your argument and the basis for it. In terms of putting restrictions or conditions on wholesale MVNO service, who's eligible, where they can operate, your position is clear that the Commission should reject such conditions. They'd be anti-competitive. Can you give me a little bit more of an unpacking of that? Are there any conditions, restrictive conditions, that would be of particular concern to you, for example?
So let me answer in a general way. I don't know if you folks want to add to it, but in a general way, the more you restrict it, the less the benefit that it's intended to yield will actually materialize. I mean, that's just the reality. If you open it up, the technology is there. You're not talking about disrupting anybody's network, making them, jump through hoops that they haven't had to jump before. You're not asking them to go to 2 years worth of CISC hearings, create new interconnections, all of that. These are all tried and tested, standards-based things that require the turning on of protocols and the creation of some links between companies. So to start restricting that, I think would be problematic. Now, I don't know if you're trying to get at things like seamless roaming and call handback. Is that some of the stuff you're trying to get at, or other things? Or
No, I'm talking about resale restrictions, limitation to residential consumer markets, the whole Internet of Things, machine-to-machine applications. Do you have a position on those kinds of restrictions?
Yeah, I think you've heard and you're going to continue to hear lots of interveners, trying to put limits on, what kind of technology, what kind of capacity, what kind of markets. Ultimately, those are just tactics that are designed to reduce the effectiveness of competition. I think that if regulation is to limit the availability of competitors to compete to certain markets or certain technologies, we're just going to be back here in another year or two wondering why there's no competition in those other markets.
And what about a concern that if there's a resale restriction, you might get enterprises getting in through the back door that they can't get in through the front door on eligibility criteria? Do you think that's a valid concern?
Well, we're not proposing that there ought to be specific eligibility criteria that way, so no, we don't see that as a concern.
Okay. And then what's your position on access to domestic and international roaming agreements under your model, just to clarify that?
Ian, do you want to comment?
We think that as part of a service offering, you need access to international roaming models and if as necessary to domestic roaming. But if there's a full MVNO, you really don't need roaming.
Right.
So we think that that's probably part of a service, but again, service innovation might dictate a certain service provider doesn't need that at all.
Right. And what's your view about the concern that's been expressed about, for lack of a more specific term, large, well-capitalized companies, large North American tech firms? Should there be any conditions placed on the MVNO model that you propose in terms of their entry into the market?
No, we wouldn't propose any restrictions that would preclude them from coming in. Frankly, if they were to come in and that were to drive down prices for Canadians and they were to become the dominant MVNO in the space, that's fine by us. Even recognizing that some might expect us to say, well, no, CNOC are largely Canadian companies, and so it should only be Canadian or something like that. We thought about that, discussed it, and we felt that it was too self-serving. Our view is that the best kind of competition will be the kind that forms by itself, and so therefore, if it comes from a foreign tech firm and so forth, then so be it.
And I gather that you're not at all in favor of commercially negotiated agreements. You think those would be non-starters, that the Commission should take on the task of setting rates?
Yes.
And
those
terms and conditions as well?
Yes, commercial negotiation would be non-starters. Yes, the Commission would need to set terms and conditions as well as the rates.
And I expect that you would agree that if parties would agree to off-tariff arrangements, that you wouldn't have a problem with that? In as a baseline condition?
Sure, as long as there starts with a tariff,
okay,
and then there's an off-tariff that's better than that. Certainly, there's nothing wrong with that. Those happen today in wireline.
And the retail minus approach to setting wholesale rates, I believe you're not in favor of that?
No. No, we're not. There's a couple of problems with that. First of all it begets is more of the same kind of stuff that you already have in the market. Second is that you don't have a proper reference point for it necessarily, because there are, which carrier's pricing do you use at what point in time, in which geography? And the Bureau's also pointed out the problem that you could end up inadvertently setting a retail price floor by taking that approach.
Pete?
Yeah, I think one of the other pieces that is missing in a retail minus is that it really doesn't foster any of the innovation that comes. All it does is, add one more player who can only differentiate on price and not attack any other innovation value that that competition brings. Retail pricing just doesn't unlock that innovative potential.
Okay. You talked about, in your comments, about access to devices. And under your proposal, you think it is acceptable to have a reasonable exclusivity period before an MVNO could get access to some of the premium devices. Do you have a concept of what would be a reasonable exclusivity period versus unreasonable?
Yeah, I guess I'll expand on that a little bit and just clarify. Sometimes we see one of the big three launch a new device, and they're the only one who has it for 30 days or 45 days or 60 days or something like that. In a case like that, if I'm an MVNO on, let's say, Rogers, we're suggesting that I should still be able to buy the phones from Rogers, but I can't sell that phone, so therefore why would I buy it, until their exclusivity period elapses. Mm-hmm. We're not proposing and not in favor of some sort of a delay where an MVNO only gets the phone after the big three have had it for some length of time or anything like that. Purely that if they were able to negotiate with one of the phone providers that they have it exclusively and nobody else does, we're simply saying that we would want to respect that. We would expect that we should respect that exclusivity period that they've negotiated. In other words, we'd be in the same, launching it at the same time period roughly as the others of the big three who didn't have that exclusivity period.
Okay. What's your position on who should be mandated to provide the MVNO access? Just the national MNOs or the regional carriers as well?
Our position is it should be the big three, the national MNOs.
Okay. But not parties such as SaskTel or regional carriers? No. Okay.
Although I'd say that they're certainly, we'd be very happy to have the conversation with them if they wanted to.
Right.
But not mandated, no.
Okay. When you talked about your model having an ease of implementation because it just is going to require some simple modifications to the wholesale roaming tariffs, and you used the Sugar Mobile example, do you think that, Sugar Mobile was one small company, it didn't have many customers permanently residing on Rogers' network? Do you think that there would be potential for opening the floodgates under your model?
I'm not sure what you mean by opening the floodgates.
Well, we've heard concerns that MVNOs come into the market, operate for a little while, and then go out of business, and that is not a good situation for consumers. And that if you don't have some skin in the game, if you don't put certain requirements for investment, that sort of thing, that you might end up with a situation where consumers are left without a service, where you're not really getting any benefit to the system because your system is so loosely set up that it's set up for failure. I mean, those are some of the comments we've heard.
First off, we certainly haven't seen any MVNOs fail in Canada. We've not had the opportunity for that to happen yet. But we should also keep in mind that if an MVNO were to fail, there's a lot of outcomes that are more likely than a bunch of stranded customers. Even when three large entrants basically failed, they were all snapped up very quickly. There's no reason to believe that the most likely outcome isn't another MVNO or one of the regionals or one of the national MNOs snap up those customers and continue to provide service. Also keep in mind, to the extent that the MVNO is still very small and it has only a few thousand customers or something like that, it's not particularly difficult, especially in the age of the eSIM, which is basically upon us now, for customers to move from MVNO to MVNO or from MVNO to MNO and any other wireless carrier. It's not like a wireline thing where you've got to roll a truck and go to a house and do some work and install them. Moving those customers should be quite reasonable, and therefore I'd say the unfortunate customers that chose that now failed MVNO would have lots of options they could switch to, even if it wasn't the subscribers themselves weren't snapped up and acquired by somebody else.
Okay. We're almost at the end of the road here. Do you have a position on access to 5G networks for this MVNO model?
Yeah, I do. Canadians have been asking for meaningful competition for years, maybe a decade. I think any model that enables competition but relegates them to legacy technology that was deployed 15 years ago is not going to be an answer to that.
On network sharing arrangements, do you believe that they help or hurt the overall competitiveness of the market?
I think they can help immensely for the reasons I said at the beginning, because it gets around a lot of the problem about the preoccupation with investment dollars. If we start focusing on using existing and upcoming investment more efficiently, but they do have to be watched. I would certainly urge this commission not to just give those agreements forborne free passage without looking at them very carefully. And particularly since they're confidential, it's unlikely that interveners will see any or much of those agreements, and understandably so. So the Commission has a very important due diligence role to play to guard against anti-competitive effects. That would be my only concern. But in terms of an economic impact, I'd say go. I mean, let them all share networks with each other. I think that'd be fabulous.
And do you share Shaw's view of the utility of having working groups to deal with some of the issues related to access to support structures, as well as access to municipal infrastructure, especially as we're getting into that 5G world?
Those things already exist largely. Many municipalities already have utility working groups in place. And, so there's no reason not to have them. Anything that helps, my view in life generally is anything that helps coordination and communication is generally a good thing, and I don't know why people would resist it.
Those are all my questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Other questions? Council? No? Then I thank you very much for your submission and your fulsome responses today. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we have one more intervener by Skype. Correct, Madam Secretary? Thank you.